When the temperature outside plunged to 34 degrees below zero and the Arctic wind began freezing cattle where they stood, Eleanor Vance was sitting comfortably in her dress, sipping hot tea in an underground room that stayed at 58 degrees without a single log burning on the fire. She burned less than 4 pounds of small wooden sticks a night, harnessed the body heat of a single cow standing directly above her ceiling, and survived the most brutal winter Minnesota had seen in 15 years, while the very men who had tried to starve her out were forced to beg her for warmth. To understand how a 34-year-old widow accomplished what the most experienced builders in the county considered impossible, you have to go back to November 1,894 inches, the settlement of Frost Hollow. The air was already turning brittle, and the ground was hardening into iron when Gideon and Silas Vance rode up to the homestead on 2 heavy draft horses. They were her late husband Arthur's brothers, men with thick shoulders, cold eyes, and a sharp legal notice stamped by the county clerk. Arthur had died from quick pneumonia 6 months earlier in April, and before his body was even settled in the churchyard soil, his family had begun eyeing the property. The farm consisted of 95 acres of mixed timber and pasture, a drafty single-room log cabin built 20 years prior, an 11 by 13-foot woodshed, and a small barn that leaned slightly toward the eastern tree line. Standing in the autumn mud, Gideon handed Eleanor the paper without dismounting. He told her she had 30 days to clear her things off the property. The original land patent, he claimed, had been issued in their father's name, making Arthur merely a tenant and leaving Eleanor a childless widow with no blood relation to the family, with no legal standing to remain on the homestead. Eleanor stood on the porch in a faded apron, holding the paper as the cold wind whipped hair across her face. When she quietly told them that she and Arthur had cleared 20 acres of that ground with their own hands, Silas laughed. It was a dry, hollow sound that carried across the frozen yard. He told her that sentiment did not hold legal weight in Minnesota, and that a woman living alone on a farm without money or a man's labor was a burden the family had no intention of carrying through another winter. To ensure she understood her helplessness, the brothers took immediate action to force her departure. They declared that all timber on the 95 acres belonged to the family estate. They barred her from cutting standing oak or hauling fallen pine from the woodlot, and they instructed the town sawyer not to credit her for cordwood. They believed the harsh environment would do their dirty work for them. Without a massive stack of seasoned hardwood to feed the cabin's hungry open fireplace, no human being could survive a Minnesota winter. They assumed she would pack her bags, surrender the land, and head south to seek charity in Minneapolis. Everyone in Frost Hollow expected the same thing. The townspeople knew the math of frontier survival all too well. To get through a northern winter, an ordinary, single-room log cabin required at least 6 to 8 cords of good hardwood. Eleanor had a small Guernsey cow named Clover, 10 laying hens, a small woodshed containing less than a week's worth of dry kindling, and not a single silver dollar to her name. The nearest town was 12 miles of rutted dirt road away, and the historical record low for the region sat at a terrifying 34 below zero. What her brothers-in-law did not realize, however, was that Eleanor Vance was not a woman who panicked when driven into a corner. She looked at the towering walls of the dense forest surrounding the farm. She looked at the drafty log cabin that bled heat through every chinked seam. And then she looked down at the dark, heavy earth beneath her boots. She knew something about the soil that the men on horseback had completely overlooked. She knew that while the surface world above was a battleground of wind and ice, the earth beneath held an ancient, unyielding secret. Long before she ever set foot in the territory of Minnesota, Eleanor had lived in a small coal mining patch in southwestern Pennsylvania. Her father, Caleb Weir, had spent 18 years descending 300 feet into the dark bellies of the Appalachian Hills, hauling anthracite out of deep seams where the sun never shone. Caleb was a practical, observant man who spent his evenings explaining the mechanics of the subsurface world to his young daughter while cleaning coal dust from beneath his fingernails. He taught her that human beings built their homes entirely backward for cold climates. Above ground, he would explain, a house was constantly battered by wind. Wind was a heat thief. High-velocity air scoured warmth off log walls and wooden planks like a rasp against pine, stripping thermal energy faster than any stone fireplace could produce it. Furthermore, wood and plaster were thin barriers against a dropping thermometer. But down in the deep mine shafts, regardless of whether a summer heat wave was baking the valley or an Arctic blizzard was burying the mountains under 3 feet of drift, the subterranean temperature never changed. Below the frost line, the depth to which groundwater freezes in winter, which ran roughly 5 to 6 feet deep in the Midwest, the Earth maintained a constant, unyielding baseline temperature between 50 and 55 degrees Fahrenheit. The soil was an infinite thermal reservoir. It absorbed the sun's energy during the long summer months and held on to that energy throughout the winter, insulated from the howling surface air by feet of packed clay and stone. Down deep, the ground remembered warmth. Sitting in her cold cabin during the first week of November, listening to the draft whistle through the corner logs, Eleanor realized that trying to heat her husband's log house was a losing battle. The cabin had 10-foot ceilings, an oversized stone chimney that drew cold air inward every time the fire died, and 4 exterior walls exposed to 40-mile-an-hour prairie winds. To heat that structure through January, without access to the family timber lot, would require chopping down half an acre of trees by herself, an impossible physical task for a lone woman using a dull double-bit axe. She resolved that she would not fight the winter on the surface. She would build a hidden sanctuary beneath the earth, utilizing the precise principles her father had taught her in the coal camps. Her selection of the woodshed as the location for her underground room was a stroke of deliberate, practical engineering. The woodshed was an unassuming 11 by 13-foot frame structure built on low stone footings. Because it had a solid shake roof overhead, Eleanor could dig beneath its floorboard structure without being exposed to falling snow or rain. The surrounding wooden walls of the shed would act as an outer windbreak, screening her excavation work from any eyes on the main road a quarter-mile away. More importantly, the woodshed floor was constructed from thick, rough-sawn hemlock planks resting on heavy oak joists. If she dug a chamber directly beneath those joists, the floor of the shed would become her ceiling. She could house her Guernsey cow, Clover, inside the shed directly above her head, transforming the livestock itself into an overhead heating element. She designed the underground chamber to measure 9 feet long, 7 feet wide, and 7 feet deep. It would be compact, tight, and buried safely beneath the frost line. It was large enough to hold a narrow straw bed, a small cooking setup, and her preserved food crates, yet small enough that her own body heat and a handful of dry twigs would elevate the temperature to total comfort. She gathered her tools, an old iron spade, a short-handled miner's pickaxe her father had left her, 2 6-gallon wooden buckets, and a coiled length of hemp rope. On the night of November 4th, with a cold rain pattering against the woodshed roof, Eleanor lit a single tin oil lamp, pried up 3 central floorboards inside the shed, and struck the pickaxe into the dark, damp earth. The physical labor of breaking hard ground alone in the dark was grueling beyond anything Eleanor had ever experienced. The top 2 feet of soil were dense loam mixed with tangled tree roots and river gravel that jarred her wrists every time the iron pick struck. She worked in 2-hour stretches, swinging the pick, shoveling the loosened soil into the wooden buckets, and then hauling those 12-pound loads up out of the pit to carry them into the deep pine woods behind the barn. She was careful to spread the fresh dirt under thick beds of fallen pine needles so that no visible piles would alert her in-laws that she was moving earth. On the 3rd morning of her excavation, as she was coming out of the woodshed with dirt smudged across her forehead and her dress stiff with dried clay, a horse and wagon pulled into the yard. It was Thaddeus Wright, Frost Hollow's master carpenter and veteran builder. Wright was a man of 60, with a grand white beard and an unshakable confidence in his own construction knowledge. He had built the town hall, the Lutheran church, and nearly 30 log and timber homes across the county. He had stopped by the Vance farm to retrieve a large timber framing slick he had loaned to Arthur 2 years prior. When Wright walked into the woodshed to search Arthur's workbench, he stopped dead in his tracks. He stared at the gaping 4-foot hole in the center of the floorboards, then looked at the pick, the shovel, and the dirt-stained woman standing before him. When Eleanor calmly explained that she was excavating a small living space beneath the floor to stay warm through the coming winter, Wright's face turned red with a mixture of shock and disbelief. He threw his hands in the air and told her she was attempting something outright insane. He explained to her, using the loud tone of an expert addressing an ignorant child, that unreinforced earth walls would heave and cave in the moment the ground froze hard. He warned her that by digging beneath the woodshed's floor joists, she was undermining the structural stability of the footings. The first heavy snowpack on the roof, he insisted, would cause the entire shed to collapse downward, burying her in a clay grave. Wright declared that earth was not a source of warmth, but an icebox. He pointed out that every cellar in the county turned cold as a tomb by November, and that moisture rising from damp dirt would rot her clothing, ruin her food, and fill her lungs with lethal lung fever within a month. Real shelter, he argued, required solid 8-inch spruce logs, heavy lime chinking, and a roaring hardwood fire. A person could not simply burrow into the dirt like a prairie dog and expect to outsmart a northern winter. He told her she was wasting what little strength she had left on a foolish fantasy. Before Wright could leave, Gideon and Silas Vance rode into the yard to check if Eleanor had begun packing her belongings. Hearing the carpenter's loud protests inside the woodshed, the two brothers walked in and discovered the excavation for themselves. Gideon looked down into the muddy pit, then looked at Eleanor's blistered hands and let out a harsh laugh. He told Wright not to bother arguing with her, saying it was clear the grief of losing Arthur had unhinged her mind. Silas stepped to the edge of the pit and told Eleanor that her dirt digging was a pathetic display. He mocked her, saying that if she preferred living beneath a woodshed floor to acting like a civilized woman and leaving the property gracefully, she was welcome to try. He taunted her by stating that when the real Arctic cold arrived in December, they would not even need to enforce the eviction notice. Nature would freeze her out of her hole, and they would reclaim the land without firing a shot or paying a deputy. Eleanor stood quietly against the workbench, her spade resting in her hand. She did not raise her voice. She did not offer a single word of defense or try to explain the geothermal physics her father had taught her. She simply watched the three men talk. When they finally turned and walked out into the cold morning air, mocking her project as they went, Eleanor waited until the sound of their wagon wheels faded down the road. Then, she picked up her lamp, stepped back into the pit, and drove the steel spade deep into the clay. By the middle of November, the surface ground across Minnesota had frozen solid, but inside the sheltered perimeter of the woodshed, Eleanor had dug past the frost line. In total, she hand-excavated approximately 440 cubic feet of clay, loam, and gravel. A staggering physical feat that required filling, lifting, and dumping more than 2,000 bucket loads of earth. Her hands had developed thick, yellowed calluses, and her shoulders had hardened from the relentless lifting, but the subterranean room had taken its final shape. At a depth of 7 feet, Eleanor reached a dense, unyielding layer of hard-pan blue clay mixed with granite river gravel. It was well beneath the regional frost line, completely shielded from freezing temperatures. The air down in the pit felt strikingly different from the air in the woodshed above. Up top, her breath condensed into thick white clouds in the 20-degree chill. Down in the excavation, the air felt soft, still, and remarkably mild, resting at a stable 52 degrees Fahrenheit. To address the master carpenter's warnings regarding structural collapse, Eleanor applied a series of organized, highly effective reinforcement techniques. She did not leave the ceiling unsupported. From the woodshed's original construction, heavy 4x8-inch floor joists ran horizontally overhead. To reinforce these, she salvaged 6 8-inch thick oak crossbeams from a collapsed boundary fence on the edge of the pasture. She cut these beams to length using Arthur's crosscut saw, notched them deeply into the solid clay ledges she had carved into the side walls, and braced them vertically with heavy cedar posts set onto flat granite footings at the floor level. This timber framework transferred the overhead load of the woodshed floor directly down to the bedrock floor, ensuring that even if several tons of weight were placed on the shed floor above, the ceiling of her room could not sag or collapse. Next, she turned her attention to the raw clay walls. Unreinforced dirt walls could crumble over time as ambient moisture shifted. To build a permanent barrier, Eleanor spent 4 days hauling flat, dense limestone slabs from a dry creek bed half a mile away, carrying them two at a time in a wooden wheelbarrow through the snow. She hand-stacked these stone slabs along the entire perimeter of her room, building a tight, dry masonry wall 18 inches thick against the clay banks. This limestone lining provided a vital, structural, and thermal benefit. The stones weighed roughly 3,000 pounds in total. Once this mass was in place, it served as a massive thermal battery. When Eleanor introduced a small heat source inside the room, the dense limestone walls would absorb that energy, hold it within their molecular structure, and radiate it gently back into the living space over a span of 8 to 12 hours. The earth behind the stone prevented heat from escaping outward, while the stone itself smoothed out temperature fluctuations, creating a self-regulating thermal environment. With the main structural chamber reinforced and walled with limestone, Eleanor executed the most brilliant element of her design, the integration of her livestock as an overhead heat generator. She cleared out the lumber clutter inside the woodshed above, laid down heavy hemlock planks across the floor joists, and constructed a tight, sturdy pen directly over the subterranean room. She then brought her 1,100-pound Guernsey cow, Clover, inside the shed, making it her permanent winter stall. The biological physics of this arrangement were extraordinarily effective. A healthy, fully grown bovine generates a tremendous amount of metabolic heat, as its digestive system processes roughage, producing approximately 16,000 British thermal units, BTUs, of heat every single day simply by existing. In a standard, high-ceiling barn, this massive output of animal heat rose quickly to the rafters and was stripped away by wind leaking through wall gaps. In Eleanor's design, however, the cow's radiant heat was captured inside the low-ceilinged woodshed. To prevent cold drafts from descending into her room while allowing warmth to transfer downward, Eleanor spread an 8-inch thick layer of dry wheat straw across the shed floorboards around Clover's pen. This dense straw layer functioned as a floor insulation blanket with an estimated thermal resistance rating of R15. It allowed the warm air generated by the cow to heat the floorboards without allowing dust or waste to fall through the cracks. The woodshed floor became an overhead radiant heating panel, keeping the ceiling of her underground room warm to the touch. For her primary heat source and cooking system, Eleanor constructed a microclay oven in the northwest corner of her room. She built the firebox out of dense river clay, wood ash, and selected field stones, shaping an interior volume no larger than a single cubic foot. Unlike an open cabin fireplace, which draws cold air across the floor and sends 90% of its heat straight up the chimney, Eleanor's clay oven was designed for maximum thermal containment. Inside the firebox, she placed 130 pounds of smooth, dense river stones she had gathered from the creek bed. When she lit a small fire using a handful of dry twigs, the combustion gases were forced to pass around these river stones before exiting through a narrow flue. The stones absorbed the fire's intense heat, climbing to temperatures over 300 degrees Fahrenheit within 45 minutes. Once the twigs burned down to ash, Eleanor closed a slide damper on the flue to trap the hot air inside. The superheated river stones inside the clay firebox then began releasing their stored energy, a total of roughly 7,000 BTUs, slowly and steadily into the room. Because the surrounding earth and limestone walls prevented this warmth from escaping, a single 3-pound armload of small branches provided continuous, comfortable heat for 6 full hours. While her neighbors were burning through 50 pounds of heavy hardwood logs a day in their cabin fireplaces just to keep their water buckets from freezing, Eleanor achieved superior comfort using nothing more than fallen brush and forest scrap. The final technical challenge Eleanor had to solve was moisture management and airflow. In any enclosed underground space, human respiration and cooking steam produce humidity. If that moisture cannot escape, it condenses on cool surfaces, creating dampness, mold, and a chill that destroys the insulating properties of clothing and bedding. To solve this, Eleanor constructed a passive ventilation system based on the stack effect, a principle her father had used to clear dangerous gases from coal entries. She obtained a 6-foot length of 4-inch iron stovepipe from a scrap pile behind Arthur's old workshop. She installed the pipe vertically in the rear corner of her room, threading it up through the woodshed floor and out through the shed's back wall, disguising the exterior opening inside an organized stack of dry kindling. This pipe served as her warm air exhaust. As the small clay oven warmed the room, the lighter, warmer air inside naturally rose toward the ceiling and flowed up through the iron pipe to the outside. This upward draft created a subtle, low-pressure zone near the floor of her room, which gently pulled fresh, dry air down through a series of small, baffled intake holes she had carved into her leather-hinged trapdoor. The air exchange was continuous, silent, and entirely passive. It moved just enough fresh air to keep the room oxygenated and dry, without creating cold drafts across her bed. Furthermore, the raw clay mortar and the thick straw floor lining acted as natural hygroscopic regulators, absorbing small spikes in humidity during cooking and releasing it slowly when the air dried out. In late November, the first true Arctic cold snap of the season swept across Minnesota. The surface temperature dropped to 12 degrees Fahrenheit overnight, accompanied by a biting 20-mile-an-hour wind that froze the surface ponds solid. Eleanor decided it was time to conduct her first full environmental test. She packed her wool blankets, her oil lamp, her cooking pot, and her sealed food crates, and moved down through the trapdoor. She lit a small fire in her clay oven, using 2 pounds of dry oak twigs, allowed the river stones to heat for 40 minutes, and then closed the flue damper. She lay down on her straw-padded bed, pulled her mother's quilt over her shoulders, and waited. Up above, she could hear the muffled, rhythmic thud of Clover's hooves shifting on the shed floorboards, and the low hum of the wind rattling the woodshed roof shakes. Down in her earth chamber, the air remained completely still. There was no wind noise, no whistling drafts, and no creaking timbers. She checked her small glass thermometer by the light of the tin lamp. Outside, the temperature was plunging towards single digits. Inside her room, the mercury sat at a steady, remarkable 56 degrees Fahrenheit. The stone walls felt smooth and mildly warm against her back. The air was dry, clean, and smelled faintly of sweet straw, wood smoke, and rich earth. She blew out the oil lamp, laid her head on her canvas pillow in the total peaceful darkness of the earth, and slept comfortably through the entire night for the first time since her husband's death. If you are enjoying this story and want to hear more forgotten survival wisdom every week, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring these incredible historical accounts to life. On the 18th of December, 1894, the weather pattern over the Midwest collapsed completely. A massive Arctic cyclone swept out of the Canadian Northwest, driving a wall of black clouds and freezing air across the plains of Minnesota. It was the beginning of a storm that old-timers in the county would talk about for 50 years, the Great Freeze of 1894. By nightfall, the ambient temperature in Frost Hollow had dropped to 24 below zero. By the morning of December 20th, the mercury hit 34 degrees below zero Fahrenheit, with sustained 45-mile-an-hour winds pushing wind chill values past 55 below. Snow fell in dense, horizontal sheets, turning the world into a blinding white void, where a man could lose his way and freeze to death between his back door and his barn. Across the valley, the traditional log cabins built by the settlers began to fail catastrophically under the physical assault of the storm. The physics of convective wind scouring took a devastating toll. The 45-mile-an-hour wind battered the exterior spruce logs, stripping heat off their surfaces 15 times faster than still air could. Warmth was sucked out of the cabins through conduction, while the high wind pressure forced freezing air through every microgap in the lime chinking. Inside these standard homes, living conditions devolved into a desperate struggle for survival. Fireplaces raged continuously, but their performance was horribly compromised by what engineers call the wet wood trap. Because most settlers had cut their firewood late in the autumn, their cordwood contained 30 to 35% internal moisture. For every pound of wet wood thrown onto a fire, more than 1,000 BTUs of heat energy were completely wasted, simply converting the internal water into steam before combustion could occur. The result was disastrous. The wood hissed, smoldered, and produced dense, acrid smoke that backed up into the living rooms when gale-force gusts battered the top of the chimneys. Creosote accumulated rapidly along the cold stone flues, sparking dangerous chimney fires in two local homes. Families were forced to huddle within 3 feet of their open hearths, wearing heavy winter coats and wool boots indoors, while the far corners of their rooms dropped to 12 degrees Fahrenheit. Water buckets sat frozen solid on kitchen tables next to burning stoves. In town, the situation turned critical. Iron water pipes in the local hotel burst, flooding the ground floor with ice slush. At the Larson farm, 2 miles east, the roof of their cattle lean-to buckled under the heavy snow load, forcing them to turn 3 horses into the gale to avoid being crushed. Families began burning their wooden furniture, chairs, tables, dressers, and fence posts as their outdoor wood piles became buried under 8-foot snowdrifts that were too hard and cold to dig through. At the main Vance homestead, Gideon and Silas were experiencing the harsh reality of their own arrogance. Their grand 2-story frame house, built with thin pine lap siding and large glass windows, bled heat like an open window. Their furnace burned through 2 weeks of dry hardwood in 4 days. By December 22nd, their supply was entirely exhausted. They were forced to move into a single ground-floor room, nailing heavy wool blankets over the doors and windows, and burning cedar fence rails in a desperate attempt to keep their elderly mother from developing frostbite. 7 feet beneath the woodshed floor, Eleanor Vance experienced the Great Freeze of 1894, as if it were happening on another continent. While 55 below wind chills scoured the surface world above, her underground room sat in total, unbroken tranquility. Because her room was buried beneath 7 feet of dense earth and stone, the wind velocity at her walls was precisely 0 miles per hour. Convective heat loss did not exist in her world. The thermal performance of her subterranean chamber was nearly perfect. The ambient air temperature in the room held steady at 58 degrees Fahrenheit day and night. Her wood supply, consisting of dry oak and maple twigs she had gathered and stored inside the woodshed during early autumn, sat at a moisture content of just 12%. When she fed 3 pounds of these bone-dry sticks into her clay oven once every 24 hours, the wood burned with a hot, clean, blue-white flame that achieved nearly 90% combustion efficiency. Her daily routine was orderly and peaceful. Every morning at 7, she would climb the short wooden ladder, open the trapdoor, and step up into the woodshed to tend to Clover. The air in the shed was cold, roughly 18 degrees Fahrenheit, but it was completely dry and shielded from the wind. Clover was healthy, warm in her deep straw bed, and producing 2 gallons of rich, warm milk a day. Eleanor would milk the cow, feed her a ration of hay, collect eggs from the hens nesting in the corner straw, and then retreat back down through the trapdoor into her warm sanctuary. Down in her earth chamber, she prepared hot cornmeal porridge and fresh milk on her clay stove. She mended wool socks by the warm yellow light of her oil lamp, read Arthur's old leather-bound books, and listened to the distant muffled rumble of the storm raging above. While neighboring families were burning 80 to 100 pounds of wood a day just to maintain a freezing interior temperature of 35 degrees, Eleanor consumed less than 4 pounds of brush per day. Her total fuel cost for the entire month of December was $0.00. From the main road, Eleanor's farm looked completely deserted. The log cabin sat dark, its windows frosted over with thick white ice, its chimney cold. The woodshed was half buried in a massive 12-foot snowdrift that had accumulated along its northern wall. The narrow iron vent pipe hidden behind the kindling stack emitted only an almost invisible wisp of hot, clear air that dissipated instantly in the howling gale. Gideon and Silas Vance, looking through a spyglass from their frozen upstairs window 2 miles away, saw no heavy smoke rising from the farm. Observed through the blinding storm, the property appeared abandoned, silent, and dead. The brothers congratulated themselves on their foresight. They were convinced that Eleanor had either fled the county weeks ago or had perished quietly inside the drafty cabin during the first night of the Arctic blast. They assumed that as soon as the roads cleared in January, they would drive their sleigh onto the property and take undisputed possession of the 95 acres. On Christmas Eve, the storm reached its absolute terrifying peak. The barometric pressure dropped to the lowest level recorded in Minnesota history, and the temperature outside Eleanor's shed touched 34 below zero. In town, master carpenter Thaddeus Wright was fighting a losing battle against the cold. His solid, multi-room home, a house he had boasted, was the best-constructed dwelling in the valley, had become unlivable. The chimney flue had cracked under thermal shock at 3 in the morning, filling the house with suffocating carbon monoxide and forcing him to put out the fire. With his house interior dropping to 14 degrees Fahrenheit and his wife suffering from severe hypothermia, Wright realized they would not survive until morning. In desperation, he wrapped his wife and 2 neighbors, the Larsons, in heavy wool horse blankets, hitched his 2 draft horses to a heavy wooden sled, and set out into the blinding whiteout toward the town church. However, less than a mile down the road, the horses stalled in a 6-foot snowdrift. One horse collapsed from the killing cold, its lungs frozen by the sub-zero air. Struggling on foot through waist-deep drifts, blinded by the wind, Wright remembered Eleanor's farm sitting just 300 yards off the road. He didn't expect to find her alive. He simply hoped to reach the shelter of her woodshed to get his weeping wife out of the direct 55 below wind chill before they all froze to death on the open road. Groping through the whiteout, Wright and the 3 shivering travelers stumbled into the farmyard and managed to haul open the heavy woodshed door, collapsing onto the hemlock floorboards inside. They pulled the door shut against the howling gale and lay in the darkness, gasping for air, their faces gray, their fingers numb and unresponsive. Then, Wright noticed something that made him freeze in place. The woodshed was cold, but it was not freezing. The air inside smelled of sweet, dry straw and the clean, metabolic warmth of a living animal. In the corner, Clover the Guernsey cow shifted in her pen, chewing her cud calmly. Even more astounding was the floor beneath his hands. The rough hemlock boards were not cold as ice, they were warm. Radiant, steady heat was rising directly through the cracks in the wood. Before Wright could process what he was feeling, a soft square of light opened in the center of the floorboards. A heavy leather-hinged trapdoor was lifted upward, and Eleanor Vance stepped into view, carrying a glowing tin lantern. She was dressed in a simple wool skirt and a light cotton blouse. Her hair was tied back neat, her skin was healthy and flushed with warmth, and her eyes were clear. Wright stared at her as if he were looking at a ghost. He stood in a frozen shed, wrapped in stiff horse blankets, unable to feel his own feet, looking down at a woman who looked as if she had just stepped out of a warm summer kitchen. Eleanor did not ask questions. She took one look at Mrs. Wright's blue lips and the shivering, dazed expressions of the Larsons, set her lantern down on the bench, and said softly, "Get down into the room." Quickly, Wright and the Larsons crawled to the opening and descended the wooden ladder into the subterranean chamber. As their bodies passed below the level of the floorboards, the effect was so profound that Mrs. Larson began to weep hysterically. It felt as though they had stepped out of a Minnesota blizzard and straight into an underground spring house in July. The air in the chamber held at a steady, blissful 58 degrees Fahrenheit. The limestone walls glowed softly in the light of the small clay oven. The air was completely dry, warm, and scented with dried lavender and wood ash. There was no wind, no draft, no sound of the storm beyond a distant, harmless hum. Eleanor moved with quiet, organized efficiency. She helped Mrs. Wright onto her straw bed, wrapping her in the dry wool quilt. She retrieved 6 river stones from the clay firebox stones that were radiating 300 degrees of stored heat, wrapped them in flannel cloths, and placed them around the shivering traveler's feet and hands. She ladled steaming hot broth made from dried navy beans and salted pork from her copper pot into tin mugs and handed them to the freezing group. Thaddeus Wright sat on the floor with his back against the warm limestone wall, holding the hot tin cup in his shaking, blistered hands. He watched the woman he had publicly mocked 6 weeks earlier as she quietly tended to his wife. He looked at the neat, dry stone walls. He looked at the 4-inch iron ventilation pipe working silently in the corner. He felt the gentle, unyielding, radiant warmth of the earth enveloping his frozen body, and he bowed his head in total, absolute humiliation. By December 28th, the storm had begun to lose its wind velocity, though the ambient temperature remained locked at 28 below zero. Word had somehow filtered through the snowbound settlement that shelter and life existed at the widow Vance's farm. Over 48 hours, 7 more desperate townspeople, including the local minister, Reverend Cord, and his elderly sister, struggled through the drifts to reach the woodshed. Eleanor turned no one away. She organized the subterranean chamber with strict, quiet efficiency, managing space and air quality while keeping everyone warm and fed. Late on the afternoon of December 28th, the woodshed door creaked open once more. 2 figures stumbled into the upper shed, dragging their boots through the straw. It was Gideon and Silas Vance. They were in a horrific state. Their 2-story frame house had become a freezer after they burned their last kitchen chairs 36 hours prior. Silas's right hand was severely frostbitten, his fingers blackened and swollen, while Gideon was shivering so violently he could barely hold himself upright. They had walked through the drifts, expecting to find Eleanor's frozen body and claim the land. Instead, stepping into the woodshed, they found the space filled with the warm, moist breath of Clover the cow and the voices of 6 townspeople rising from a square of warm light in the floor. Eleanor lifted the trap door and looked up at her brothers-in-law. Her face was completely unreadable. She saw the frost-blackened skin on Silas's hand, the hollow, desperate terror in Gideon's eyes, and the total breakdown of their arrogant pride. She did not say a word about the eviction notice. She did not mention the timber lot they had denied her, nor the cruel taunts they had hurled at her in November. She simply held the trapdoor open, looked at them, and gestured down toward the light. The 2 men descended the ladder into the earth. The wave of 58-degree warmth hit them like a physical blow. Gideon collapsed onto his knees on the straw floor, buried his face in his frostbitten hands, and wept silently. Silas sat against the limestone wall, staring at the small clay oven, unable to meet Eleanor's eyes. Eleanor walked over, handed each of them a tin mug of boiling water and a hot river stone wrapped in cloth, and went back to her work. There was no shouting, no dramatic arguments, and no petty triumph. The silence inside the earth chamber was absolute, heavy, and crushing. The 2 men who had attempted to use the Minnesota winter as a weapon to strip a widow of her home were now alive solely because of that same widow's intelligence, labor, and grace. The humiliation was total, silent, and permanent. On the 5th of January 1895, the great Arctic high-pressure system finally broke, and temperatures rose to a mild 15 degrees above zero. A traveling journalist and agricultural surveyor named Julian Prescott, writing for the Minnesota Agricultural Journal, arrived in Frost Hollow to investigate reports of a local widow who had successfully sheltered 11 people underground during the deadliest cold snap in state history. Prescott was a meticulous man trained in empirical measurement. Accompanied by master carpenter Thaddeus Wright, who insisted on acting as a witness, Prescott visited the Vance property with a calibrated mercury thermometer, a scale, and a notebook to conduct an official building performance audit. During the peak of the blizzard, with exterior temperatures at 34 degrees below zero and wind chills hitting -55, the Gideon Vance house maintained an average interior temperature of just 22 degrees, while burning 160 pounds of wet wood per day. A standard log cabin like the Larson farm averaged 35 degrees inside while burning 85 pounds of damp wood per day. Meanwhile, Eleanor's subterranean shelter held at a comfortable 58 degrees while consuming a mere 3.5 pounds of bone-dry wood per day, with zero wind velocity impact. Prescott's audit proved that Eleanor's subterranean shelter achieved a staggering 95% reduction in daily fuel weight compared to standard log construction, while maintaining an interior temperature 23 to 36 degrees warmer than any above-ground structure in the region. Prescott noted that her combination of geothermal baseline mass, river stone heat retention, and passive livestock ceiling warmth represented one of the most efficient cold climate survival designs ever documented in North America. His published article, titled The Earth Haven of Frost Hollow, was reprinted in newspapers across Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Louis, turning Eleanor Vance into an unwitting national symbol of frontier resourcefulness and practical human intelligence. Following the publication of the State Journal article and the public testimony of master builder Thaddeus Wright regarding the brothers' malicious neglect, the county circuit judge formally intervened in the estate dispute, ruling that Eleanor's extensive structural improvements and continuous occupation established overwhelming common law equity. The court officially severed the family claim and granted her sole, unencumbered deed to the entire 95-acre homestead. Disgraced by public exposure, humiliated by the townspeople's disdain, and unable to ever again hold their heads high in Frost Hollow, Gideon and Silas Vance packed their wagons, sold their town holdings at a loss, and abandoned the county before the spring thaw, never to return. Eleanor Vance remained on her land for 34 years, transforming her homestead into a thriving, highly respected farm sanctuary. She never sought fame, refused offers to publish building manuals, and politely declined numerous marriage proposals from wealthy regional landowners. Instead, she spent her long autumns helping young Midwestern homesteaders dig, brace, and reinforce their own earth-sheltered cellars, ensuring that no mother or child in her county would ever again face the threat of freezing to death in a drafty cabin. The subterranean chamber beneath the woodshed remained intact long after her peaceful passing in 1928, standing for decades as an enduring landmark of quiet human brilliance. Her story proved a timeless truth to the people of Frost Hollow that no harsh winter could ever erase. True survival is never determined by wealth, muscle, or tradition, but by the quiet strength of knowledge applied when the rest of the world insists you have nothing left. Where are you watching from today? And what is the coldest winter you have ever lived through? Have you ever seen or built an earth-sheltered room? Drop a comment below. I read every single one. And if you enjoyed this incredible story of frontier resilience and survival physics, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more real historical accounts every week.